All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this special Speaker Story Bank series. Well, it's not a series. We're starting a series in terms of having conversations with a few speakers every month in different ways. And today I'm really excited for this special episode on the construction industry. I mean, building workplaces that are rooted in positive mental health, overall well-being, community, and connection, as we know, is important to any industry. But in the construction industry, it's more important than ever. So thank you for joining us today for this deeper dive into workplace wellness in the construction sector, because I am thrilled to be joined by CEO of Motion Infusion and workplace wellness expert, Laura Putnam, and also the founder of Move Your Mind tech app and the mental health advocate, Nick Bracks. They'll both be offering us fresh perspectives on how we can promote employee well-being in the construction sector. And I'm sure what they'll be sharing today will also have broader implications for every industry. But it's certainly a conversation we need to be having more of, and not just talking about why it's still important, but really how are we getting this done? So with that, welcome Laura and Nick.
Great to be here. Thanks, Marjana.
Yeah, it's so great to see both of you. Thank you so much for joining me. You've both had extensive experiences as speakers, as consultants, through many industries. And I wanted to speak with both of you today about this topic because you've had unique experiences specifically in the construction industry. And before I begin with each of you, though, I kind of want to have like global note conversation here with both of you about why do you feel the construction industry right now is sort of at a peak for, needing more solutions in terms of mental health and overall well-being? And actually, Laura, with this one, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's pertinent not only to the construction industry, although even more, it's pertinent to all industries. Across the board, we are struggling with rising rates of employee mental distress. And while research such as a study conducted by McKinsey Health Research Institute shows that over 70% of companies across 15 countries are prioritizing mental distress as a top organizational priority, as much as they are putting resources to this, they are not moving the needle. Rates of mental distress continue to stay at high levels. Now, when we talk about the construction industry specifically, many people are surprised to hear that this industry, in fact, has the second highest rate of suicide of any industry, second only to veterans. And so the question is why? And what really seems to be the case is that we have what you might characterize as a perfect storm in the construction industry. So it's a number of systemic factors that are contributing to this, such as a macho culture in which it's not okay to admit any kind of fallibility or feeling like, that we're having a weak moment. But it's also things an industry in which people are, getting injured on the job. And so as a result of that, then they turn they self-medicate, whether it's through opioids or it's through alcohol abuse. And so this becomes a perfect storm. And the real key for all industries is that we start to tackle the systemic issues and we stop looking at this as so much of a one-off kind of, let's identify the individuals at risk and connect them with the resources that they need. And instead we recognize that we are facing systemic issues that is putting everyone at risk.
Yeah, thank you for that. And before you and I dive deeper into that, let's bring Nick in really quick, because Nick, to add on to what Laura said, one of the reasons I want to speak with you today is because your podcast, Move Your Mind, you actually had a series segment from that podcast that was called Brick by Brick. And it was a series that was dedicated to the construction sector. So can you tell us a little bit about how that started and why that was important to you?
Yeah, that was super important to me, and it's I've come from a mental health background. I've been advocating for the cause for about 15 years, and I fell into the construction industry because, as Laura, put it so well, it's systemic, and these issues are so severe. Second highest rate of suicide, globally. It's male dominated, and I just fell into it. I kept getting booked for talks in construction organizations, and I saw this happening time and again. And I thought, okay, like there's something here. And I think being a man, talking about my experience, being able to try and find a way to really break down those stigmas and connect with people in those organizations really resonated. So that led to doing the podcast. We had Lendlease, who are a big construction company in Australia, sponsor it and really get behind it. And it was incredible seeing the response we had from that.
Yeah.
It was, really.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's some, people might think differently about, the construction space. You might think, oh, there's really great community there. They're, they get along, they're guys, they'll go out for drinks. This is kind of the feeling, I've had about the construction industry. So it's, just it's sort of sobering to have those conversations with you, to learn about the other side of that. But what was surprising to you when you started having more of these conversations through the podcast?
Well, what was surprising to me was just how many people are struggling with these issues and how many people want to talk about it and want to hear about it. And I had this both from the podcast and through the talks I was doing. I mean, there's so many examples, but, the most extreme one was a talk that I did where a leader in the company at the end of the talk came and admitted that he had a plan to end his life in 2 days' time. And, he was a leader who never, ever talked about it. What really led to the podcast initially. And he went and got help from that. And it was only because, I wasn't saying anything crazy. It was because he just needed to hear that message and it gave him permission to talk about it. And we saw this time and time again through the podcast, having leaders, CEOs, leaders in these organizations talking about their issues, people coming out through hearing it, thinking, just this sigh of relief that, if the CEO of my organization is talking about their own problems and they're saying that it's okay and they're giving us a guideline on how we can do it, then maybe it's okay for me to talk about it too. Because a lot of the time they're terrified about being judged by coworkers, being looked down upon. Job security is already, terrible in the industry. There's so much uncertainty. So they don't want to do anything that's going to potentially affect that. So yeah, it was really incredible seeing just how many people came out of the woodworks from having those conversations.
Yeah, such an important conversation. This is the thing, you just never know that when you're having these conversations, whether through the podcast or, whether you're on stage talking about it, who's listening and how is it really changing lives? And like you even said for that podcast, it's, story by story, brick by brick, one conversation at a time. So that's amazing to hear that and the change that affected. Laura, I'd love to bring you in from that leadership perspective as well, because you've worked with, I believe, over 50,000 managers and speakers that you've guided in terms of, your wellness expertise and that space. And, what are you kind of seeing and hearing from leaders now? Because we know we certainly have gone through the ebb and flow of, yes, it's important. Yes, we need it. And there's a big focus on it. And then people are like, I'm so tired of talking about this. Let's move on to something else. We know that wellness and well-being will always be important in the workplace. But how are you finding those conversations today?
Well, I think what's really tricky is in my conversations with managers and leaders, and just as you said, I've now worked with over 50,000 managers and executives across all industries over the past 17 years. And it's how do we move beyond this step of addressing things like mental distress one conversation at a time? While that is important, it's just a first step. So the way to think about this is, two people having a picnic on the side of a river, and suddenly they see a drowning kid out there. They both dive in, they save the drowning kid. No sooner have they come on shore than they hear two more kids who are drowning. They go out, and this goes back and forth. They keep going in rescuing these drowning kids. And then finally, one is out there rescuing a drowning kid, and he looks and he sees his friend is going up shore, and his friend says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I don't know about you, but I'm going to go up shore and I'm going to go tackle the guy who keeps throwing these kids into the river in the first place." So managers and leaders really have to look beyond these downstream solutions to really tackle the upstream causes, because we know that if we can solve one problem upstream, we can save ourselves from having to solve 10,000 problems downstream. So if we look at something like construction, and in particular, I was working with companies in the pipeline construction industry, there are some deep and really hard to address systemic issues. Number one is being isolated. So if we're talking about a pipeline construction site, we have these guys who are isolated from their families, sometimes months at a time. So that's a big driver. So how can companies more meaningfully address that issue of social isolation? There's also a problem of financial instability. Like you get a lot of money on one project, but then you don't know when the next project is going to happen. So you got this boom and bust kind of scenario happening. And then finally is an issue around loss of purpose. There is a profound level of kind of this existential angst of, is this all there is in life? And those kinds of deep systemic issues have to be addressed. And those are hard to address. And so those are the kinds of upstream conversations that I'm having with these managers and leaders. And what it really comes down to is that managers and leaders have to fundamentally change the way they lead, to become new leaders, to think about incorporating well-being into their leadership style, and to be more systematic and more strategic around how they address root causes.
How are you finding that leaders are taking on that continued responsibility and sometimes elevated responsibility, right? It's just at just new levels and new highs, right?
I think it's mixed. I mean, just as Nick spoke about, what really does give me a sense of hope is the fact that there are many people who are wanting to talk about this, and it is surprising. And if you ask the question, to a group of, mostly male audience in the construction industry, and you ask them, how many of you have been impacted by suicide personally and professionally, every single hand will go up. And so there's much more of a willingness to talk about this issue. But I do think that there is a continued resistance to want to really look at things like, how do I fundamentally change my leadership style? How do I incorporate more civility into my leadership style? How do I make sure that in every single touch point over the course of my day, that I'm lifting people up as opposed to inadvertently putting them down? And then how do I actually change the way the work gets done so that these root causes are addressed? And there are no easy answers to these questions. And frankly, it's pretty easy to have an employee assistance program or to train up people to know that the symptoms and signs of people who are at risk. And again, those, while we need those, they're downstream solutions, and we have to do a better job of addressing the upstream solutions as well.
Nick, I'd love to bring you back in too, because again, as Laura said, sort of like the big three issues, that are faced here, the isolation, the social isolation, the financial instability that happens, and the loss of purpose. From those three, and in the conversations that you've had over the course of your series that you did with leaders of the construction industry, which one of those stood out the most, or that you talked about the most or tried to tackle the most in those conversations?
I would say the isolation and burnout were the two biggest. I mean, so many people just feel alone. A lot of people are working alone. A lot of people don't feel like they feel isolated in the sense of community. They're working job to job. Burnout, definitely the biggest though. I think everyone felt overworked. Work hours are longer. In Australia, 6-day work weeks, things like that, where they just are working themselves into the ground and often away from family for, long periods at a time. And the effects are enormous that come out of that. And it's just, when it's not addressed, when it's not talked about, people start feeling trapped and they feel like, well, what do I do? I'm struggling. I'm not coping. I've got to support my family. I have, it's like you're in a prison cell without a key. They don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. And that's really when the problems happen. Alcohol, drug abuse is huge in that industry. That's one of the main coping mechanisms. So I think they were, some of the biggest things I've come across. And just to add to, while it's top of mind to what Laura was talking about before, I couldn't agree more with, how these issues are addressed in organizations. I think the key thing that Laura was talking about, we need to be preventative. A lot of it's just reactive solutions, and it's not enough. And I've seen it time and time again, with EAP programs, with leaders just putting, it's ticking a box. Okay, we need to address mental health. We need to be seen to be doing the right thing. Let's put an EAP program in. Let's, and I've talked to a lot of these, companies about how they actually implement these programs. And a lot of the time, they admitted to me, well, we knew we just had to do it. We Googled and just found whatever we could and just put that in because we needed to tick the box. And, they have a speaker come in and do a talk. They might have an EAP program. I worked with a company that were paying, $2 million a year for the EAP program and had, I think, 5 people over that a 12-month period actually use it and utilize it. So they understand it's not working, but they don't know what to do. There's not enough accountability for them to take that further action. And it just can only go so far. I've done a lot of talks myself where I would get hired to go and, do a 1-hour presentation, but I'll always go back to the company and say, well, what's your follow-on? You need to have a plan further than this. You need to have some sort of program that you can implement, and it needs to be tailored to the organization, because if we're just putting band-aid solutions, it's not gonna help.
Yeah, so with that, I know that you have some solutions from your side as well. I mean, you have with the Move Your Mind, it's an app. You could tell us a little bit about that here too, but also from your own experience, of having mental distress and these issues as well, and having written a book about all of that as well. How are you helping them create solutions?
Yeah, I think the key thing is the customization and being able to work individually with organizations. I think especially for the construction industry, having a one size fits all is going to be really difficult to make work. So really being able to go into each organization and try and understand what's going on. A lot of these issues are so systemic, and organizations like a microcosm of society, and to try and change these, ongoing issues is it takes a lot of work, and it takes a sort of everyone's really got to jump in and be part of that change. So talking to them, finding out what the issues are, and tailoring a program that can be hands-on and actually, talk to that solution, and getting actually input from the people in the company, talking to some of these construction workers, talking to employees, talking to staff, finding out what would actually help, what didn't help, after we run presentations, asking, okay, what did you like? What can we do better? How can we do more? So there's that side of it. The other side with the app that we've created, what we've really designed is that works hand in hand with doing the hands-on work. So that's a marketplace where it's a social media feed of content from wellness experts, all over the world, covering fitness, psychology, nutrition, etc. And you get endless content on there, and then employees can go and actually book a session with someone if they find, an area they want to dive into. That can, I think alone, the technology, it's really hard for that to solve the whole problem, but I think it can be part of the solution. But again, being hands-on, and I guess the final part for me, personally, and what I've seen work, it's been just going back to basics, being holistic about it. Okay, are we getting enough sleep? Are we exercising? Am I eating well? Am I doing all of these different things? Often we're not. And in the construction industry, I'd say, 90% of the time, most of the people are missing some of these key fundamentals. So if you address that and think, okay, let's try and improve these areas first, and then let's see how we're feeling. Often it'll be a gigantic change, and then you're in a better position to try and really tackle the problem. So yeah. I think that part's really big as well.
Yeah, that's so great. I mean, it really comes down to just simply the awareness, just continuing to build that awareness around it, the storytelling, the sharing, those conversations. So thank you for all that you're doing in that space too. Laura, really looking at the example then of you working in the pipeline industry, the gas industry there, you did that over a period of months. So when it comes down to really, consulting and working with leadership on this, What were some of the solutions that you were presenting then in terms of, yes, these upstream conversations, but how do they start to really get applied on a day-to-day basis and really have people thinking about this and not just thinking about it, but really making the change to do the different things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, as Nick was speaking about, mental health is part of a bigger equation. It's about holistic well-being. Just take the example, the bridge between despair and hope is a good night's sleep. We cannot underestimate how much the basics really make a difference in our overall well-being. But, one of the things that I really think about, and the thing that I'm really trying to relay to these leaders and managers that I am so privileged to get to work with, including with this group, the Interstate Natural Gas Association. I worked with them for 2.5 years, in which I came in and was brought in as a speaker for their executives, again, over a 2.5 year period, multiple times each year. But it's really this conundrum that wellness as an industry is thriving, but we as individuals, we are not. We are less healthy. We are more distressed. We are more burned out. We're more obese than we've ever been, and yet wellness is exploding. It's one of the fastest growing industries. So the 4 key things that I'm really stressing with the managers that I get to work with is for them to think about is first and foremost to ask the questions. To ask the questions such as, is it really about the individual or might it be more about the environment and the culture? Then number 2 is to study the currents. So if we consider the analogy, it's less about the fish and more about the water that the fish is swimming in. What are the currents that each fish is up against? So on a societal level, each fish needs to be asking themselves, am I healthier, more enabled to be my best self because of the larger world that I live in, one in which we are moving from tables to takeout when it comes to how we dine, or we're moving from going to the movie theater to Netflix at home alone, to the fact that we're born to move, but we're told to sit, or the fact that we're designed to be in connection with one another, and yet we're designed to take breaks and we feel pressure to always be on. These societal shifts are enormous. And so at a minimum, we need to become more aware of those so that we can better navigate them. But really the big question comes to, how do we change the water itself? So if we look at things like blue zones, which are these hotspots of longevity, places like Icaria, Greece, it's not that these individuals are that much more aware or that much more motivated than the rest of us. It's just because they happen to have been lucky enough to have been born into a company to a community in which it's normal to be well. And so then finally, we need to empower and equip a leader so that they can lead better.
How are people finding, the stream and sort of that when you're talking about, again, swimming upstream, downstream, that kind of, analogy around that? Are they reacting to that kind of storytelling around it? Is it changing the conversation and giving them a different way, a different perspective toward it?
The truth of the matter is that facts don't move people as much as these leaders say, I need to hear the evidence. I mean, for example, you share with them the fact that a construction worker now is 5 times more likely to die by suicide than an accident on the job. So a leader is 5 times more likely to have a death by suicide than they are to have a death by accident on the job. So you can tell them that, but then you can tell them analogies such as the one that I shared, which is, you put a healthy fish in unhealthy water, and I promise you that fish will become less healthy. And conversely, you put an unhealthy fish or a burned out, stressed out fish in a healthy environment, in healthy water, and I promise you they will become healthier. So, but then along with these analogies is sharing stories. So in this 2.5 year engagement with the Interstate Natural Gas Association, the most powerful part of it was when I actually brought in a guest speaker, Sergeant Kevin Briggs. He spent 17 years patrolling Golden Gate Bridge And part of that, a big part of his job was actually intercepting people who were about to jump. He had over 500 interactions with people. And as you might imagine, these stories are riveting. And it's those kinds of stories that I think, as well as analogies, that really move people. So we have to think about, how do we get them there in the first place? And how do we really speak to people on an emotional level, especially those leaders, and then help them to understand why it's so much more about them and what they do for the larger environment and culture and about fixing the workplace itself than it is about individuals fixing themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to bring both of you in to this part of the conversation, because especially Laura, as you said, the Golden Gate Bridge. Nick, I recall you speaking about this in one of your talks, about that the people who have survived jumping off the bridge have said the one thing that they all share is that as soon as they jump, their feelings of regret, like the remorse that hits, right? Can you share a little bit about that, and when you were sort of doing research on this, and and how that felt for you too, as someone who has struggled with mental health earlier on as well, and how you had to find your way through the darkness?
Yeah, absolutely. I did a TED talk on that topic and interviewed a bunch of people for it. And it really hit home, so hard, because you just hear from every single person, as you were just saying there, that survived. They all said the split second they had pushed themselves off that bridge, they instantly regretted it. So it's just devastating thinking about that, and the people that, didn't survive going through that. And it really hit home for me, because I've had these examples in my own life. As I said before, one of them, when I had that leader come up to me after the session and talk about how he had the plan to end his life. So it really motivates me to, try and just, as we're talking about, as Laura was talking about there, to keep sharing my story, to keep talking about this, to keep spreading the message, because sometimes we don't feel like it is helping people, but it really does. I haven't done one talk where I haven't heard something back from someone where they've taken something out of it, they've gone and gotten help or whatever it is. So people just want to hear these messages. They want to feel heard. And we tell ourselves stories, all the time. As you said, I got into this industry because I had my own mental health issues, and it would be stories of, I'm not enough, I can't handle this, I'm not going to cope, I don't see a future, whatever it was. And you eventually realize that they actually are just stories. This is your mind telling you certain things. I love the way Laura put it before about, having a good night's sleep. Sometimes that can just be the change. So with experience, you start to learn, oh, okay, my mind's telling me this. I'm not feeling great right now, but I don't have to believe this. I don't have to buy into it. The emotion won't go away straight away, but I'm just going to, move forward. I'm not going to sort of think too much into this. Let's maybe wait till we feel clear and good again, and then let's think about it. And often it's a different story. And companies, the truth of the matter is, companies just in the construction industry, especially, companies as a whole, but especially in that industry, just do not prioritize, the basics: sleep, nutrition, having these conversations enough, exercise. And just a final point on that, I just found it fascinating when I was doing a contract for a large construction company in Australia. We individually went to 120 sites, where I did a talk at every single site, and we would interview and chat to the employees after each session. And this company they were spending so much money doing all of these different initiatives and trying all these different things that they thought would work. When we actually spoke to the people, they pretty much across the board said one thing: we don't really care. We don't even want, we don't want more money. These initiatives we don't really care about, because, they weren't trying to tailor it. It was, we just want to be heard. And we want to have community. We want, used to do barbecues where we could bring our families and do different things. We want that. And at the end of the day, it's just that connection. People want to feel connected, and we don't have enough of that. So I think it's just such an important thing to, take on board, and that, companies need to realize, let's go back to basics. Let's listen to the people and try and look at how we can really connect and, humanize the workplace.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. I mean, it's such a great point. And Laura, when you talk about purpose, right? When they feel that they've lost a sense of purpose, and then the burnout and all the things that they're feeling, the one simplest solution here, as Nick said, is like community and connection. So, and we of course know that now, like even loneliness has just become the epidemic that the Surgeon General talks about. It's affecting every industry. But when you, again, Laura, look at your work that you've been doing in this industry, how much of that conversation then about that community and connection is surfacing in a new way?
Well, I think that a lot of people are talking about loneliness right now, but again, I think Nick really hit the nail on the head when he talked about humanizing the workplace. And so, whether we're talking about fostering more connections at work to really try to prevent people from becoming distressed in the first place, or we're talking about just basic health and well-being, or we're talking about just people loving their job or not. It's really about humanizing the workplace. And while there are certainly things that we can do as individuals, we can really work to master our mindset and we can raise our awareness. There's only so far that we can do that. Resilience can only go so far. So you might be taking advantage, one of the few people taking advantage of an employee assistance program, for example. But if you have a toxic boss and you're having to do the work of 3 day in and day out, it is really, really, really hard to be well. And again, these are the systemic issues. This is where the rubber hits the road. And this is also where it gets really hard to be able to meaningfully make a difference. And this is where leaders have to step up.
Mm. What and I love that, right? Because we always talk about, and we've had many conversations about this, about that individual level versus, again, the group, your environment, and so much of what you talk about. And it is a different perspective to it, especially as we look at so many employees who are still working from home, and then this call to action to bring more employees back. I'm wondering, Laura, from your perspective, obviously, that's a conversation that, has people on both sides tugging away at it. But when you look at that wellness, what would you say to those companies who want to bring their employees back fully or finding balance? You seem to believe it is important to have community together, be in the office, but create an environment that is healthy. But how do they balance that with the employees that really do want to find the balance by being part at home, part in the office?
Yeah, it's kind of a moment like in the great powerful Oz, in which the Oz, who turned out to be a fraud, he said, I may not be the wizard that you want, but I may just be the wizard you need. Which is, I think a lot of people are resisting coming back into the office, but it may just be exactly what we need. And the interesting thing is that the more time that we spend at home during work time actually weirdly translates into more time that we spend alone during our leisure time. And so the amount of time that we are alone, and again, weirdly, the amount of time that we are seeking solitude has vastly increased. And so while a little bit of alone time can be bliss, if it is in such large quantities as what we are seeing today, where we are effectively creating anti-social societies, it is fundamentally bad for us. It is accelerating rates of despair. It is accelerating polarization. It is accelerating the extent to which we're just not nice to each other. Yeah. And so it's all of these things that are happening. So back to the piece about return to work, the piece about it that I think that people have loved about work from home is the autonomy that it has provided for them. So the real question is, how can we bring people back in a way that is humane, but also allows people to retain that level of autonomy that they have gained through work from home?
Yeah, that's such a great point about that. I mean, and it is finding that balance back at work, back in the office. Nick, are you seeing something different in with the leadership that you're working with on that topic as well, and trying to find the right way to balance it in terms of that mental health perspective as people are bringing more of their employees back to the office.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been, as Laura's saying, that advantage of the autonomy if you can work at home, but, so many mental health issues come out of it. And I think it's like training a muscle, as Laura's saying there. If you're at home a lot of the time, you're then not going to really feel the urge to go and meet up with other people. You're going to really fall into that mindset of being alone. So sometimes, we don't want to go to the gym a lot of the time. We force ourselves to go in there, and then you feel great. You're more likely to go again. And, it's really healthy for us. And we're built to be in communities. We're built to be, working with other people and, supporting each other. And if we don't have that, if that's not nurtured in an organization, the place where we spend so much of our time, it's going to have a follow-on effect in other areas of our life. So I've seen it in so many companies. A lot of companies are, talking to me about how can we try and empower employees that are working from home to, to take better care of themselves and manage that situation. And a lot of it comes down to, taking that accountability of, okay, how do I create more of a rigid routine for myself? If I am going to work at home, getting up at a certain hour, going in a different room, separating that. So I'm not just all, doing everything, my leisure time, my downtime, my family time, my work time in one place. Being really strict. Okay, at this time I'm going to the gym. At this time I'm switching off from work, and I'm, having these periods. And I think even if we are, back at work physically, that still applies, because we now live in a world where technology has made everything 24/7. It's why burnout's becoming, such a huge issue. We don't switch off. We don't know how to, not respond to an email at 11 at night when we're lying in bed, and then we don't sleep properly, and then that follows into the next day. So, again, I think from, what I've done with myself and the work I do, it's really that, going back to those basics of how do I take that accountability to be the person who shows up for myself. When I'm working, I'm on, and I do a really good job, and I do this. I apply that same psychology to everything else in life. I look after my body. I look after my mind. I prioritize sleep. I prioritize time with family, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, what will come from that, as we see in studies of companies that do implement this stuff properly, you will perform better at work. You'll have more longevity. You'll have less turnover. A lot of companies need to see the tangibility, need to see how is this going to improve the bottom line. So once they do see that, it clicks. But again, a lot of the time, that's a lot of work. So instead of doing that and, being preventative, taking, one step back to go 10 steps forward, it's no, let's just put a Band-Aid on it, and, the problem continues. So, that's a bit of a long-winded answer to that one.
Well, it's an important answer, right? And so, with that, I want to kind of give both of you an opportunity for some closing remarks, especially for the construction sector. And, Laura, again, with everything that we've discussed today about just the burnout rates, the purpose, right? They need the purpose piece of it, the financial instability. From all of those perspectives, what would you like to leave our audience with, anyone from the construction industry here today that is listening? And as we share clips from this with our colleagues in this space, what would you like to leave them with today in terms of next steps that they could do to start creating that how towards a new way of mental health in the construction sector?
I think that the big message is this idea that we become the environment that we are in. So choose wisely. But part two of this is, what if practically speaking, you can't? So the real key becomes those people who are the key shapers of the environment. So whether it is politicians who are shaping the larger world that we live in, or it is executives who are shaping the workplaces that we work in, and then it is those managers that shape the experience within the team. And practically speaking, the culture that we experience when we are at work is largely the culture that we experience within the team. So whether or not well-being, mental health, or even culture is part of the job description, Every manager is, in fact, uniquely positioned within the workplace to make or break the day-to-day experience for their team members around overall well-being, but also when it comes to mental health. And so for those managers, you are the key differentiators for the people that you lead around their mental health. And so while mental health has been framed up as something that is all about what the individuals should be doing for themselves, I would argue that it's less about individuals engaging in self-care, and it's more about you as a team leader really fostering more team care across the team. And for those top leaders, how can you foster more well-being across the entire organization?
I love that. And just to add to that, right, it's important for those leaders to know they're not alone either. Yes, you might be sort of leading the charge and creating the environment, but it's what you'll get back from your people once you start doing that in a deeper way, right, Laura?
And also what leaders do for one another. I mean, that is actually one of the unexpected outcomes that I've seen in this work with both managers and executives, is that they start reaching out to one another and providing more peer-to-peer support. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because leaders are also struggling. I mean, a Deloitte study found that 70% of executives are reporting high levels of mental distress. So this is something that is impacting all of us. And so that peer-to-peer support across leaders is also really important.
Yeah, no one should have to bear the burden alone. No leader, no individual contributor, right? We're in this together. With that, Nick, what would you like to leave for the construction sector here, anyone that's watching, in terms of those next steps that you would suggest to create better mental health in that sector?
Yeah, I would say, going back to, the simple thing of let's humanize the workplace. Let's really look at how do we build community connection within the workplace? How do we create these conversations, from the top down? As we're saying, if you're putting an unhealthy fish in the pond, it's going to infect the whole thing. So if the leaders aren't knowing how to do this stuff themselves, how on earth is everyone else going to have a chance? So really looking at it in that way, okay, how can we educate leaders? How can we create a conversation, that peer-to-peer conversation that will trickle down and it will start to change that culture? So really making a point of that, looking at the basics of, like I said, how can we encourage employees to take more accountability, to look after the basics of their sleep, their fitness, their nutrition, etc., and really just encouraging connection, getting people to hear stories from other people, getting people to really look at it in that way, because at the end of the day, we're all just people and we all have core needs and we all need to feel heard and we all need to do certain things every day to feel healthy. As we're saying, if you're too isolated, it's going to have horrific effects on your mental well-being. And I think the final part I would say is probably rebranding mental health within organizations. I know, again, being a male-dominated organization, a lot of the men will feel, oh, well, that's weak. That's embarrassing. I'm not going to, I've been into construction sites where, these people have been in there for 30 years and they're thinking, well, that's for weak people. I'm not going to talk about that. And I don't want to be seen by my colleagues talking about this stuff. So if we can brand it and find a way to really disarm people, that's what I've done a lot of the time, going in there and self-deprecating, disarming, finding a way to cut through for what, working, really trying to listen. What does this person actually, what are they going to respond to? And talking about it in a way of, self-improvement rather than just mental health, because it's all part of the same category. But I think a lot of the time, if people are hearing mental health, they think, oh, well, I'm not going to do that because that's overwhelming me. And that's only for people that are, suffering to that extent, which it is, but it's also for everyone. So finding that way, again, I come back to that word of humanizing the workplace.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I want to bring you both back in. Yes. And thank you so much for the work that you both do in this space. I mean, through my experience with both of you, have found you to be grounded leaders in this space on this conversation. You are leading by example with the work you do as well for yourselves, and also how you're guiding other leaders to do this work. So, and, as we've all talked about here, it really comes down to that connecting on that very human level, knowing that we're all experiencing in varying degrees in different ways, but potential issues around this. And we all have our bad days, and we all have the days that get really dark. And how do we pull ourselves out of that? To your point, Laura, it comes, back to building that community too. And you've said it as well, Nick. So it's that community connection, more storytelling. I mean, I think what I've gotten from both of you and through the time that I've even worked with you, it's when you share those stories back about what you're hearing, when those leaders step up, when, their individual contributors step up, and we're really connecting together. So I hope that what you've shared here today is really impressing upon these leaders even more for this industry, especially to bring out those stories. And again, thank you both for your time today.
Thank you,
Thanks so much, Mirjana.
Take care.